Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of history's strangest job descriptions. Not glamorous, not well paid, and definitely not something your parents would proudly tell the neighbors about. We're talking about plague doctors. So, before we drift into this softly unpleasant corner of the past, take a moment to settle in. Maybe dim the lights a little. Get comfortable. And if you feel like it, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always oddly comforting to imagine all of us scattered across the world, quietly listening to stories about people who had significantly worse days than we do. Now then, let's begin with a small correction. A gentle one. The kind that doesn't shatter illusions too loudly. Because when most people picture a plague doctor, they imagine that iconic figure, long black robe, wide-brimmed hat, and of course the dramatic bird mask, the beak, the whole slightly theatrical, slightly unsettling outfit that looks like it wandered out of a gothic costume shop. Very atmospheric, very memorable. Also, not as common as you might think. In fact, for much of the earlier plague outbreaks, especially during the worst waves of the Black Death in the 14th century, that image simply didn't exist. There were no uniform costumes, no standardized masks, no dramatic entrances where a mysterious birdman shuffled into town like a misunderstood stage performer. Instead, what you had were men, usually tired, often underqualified, occasionally brave, and sometimes deeply unlucky. The term plague doctor didn't even mean a specially trained medical hero. It was more of a contract job, a temporary position. Picture a town council sitting around, trying not to make eye contact, as someone clears their throat and says, "Well, I suppose we should hire someone." Because at the time, medical qualifications were flexible. A plague doctor might be a trained physician, or a barber surgeon, or a man who once read a book about humors and felt reasonably confident, or someone who simply agreed because no one else wanted it. Cities would offer contracts, sometimes decent pay. Occasionally they would throw in extra perks, like housing or tax exemptions for your family. It all sounds almost generous, until you remember the working conditions, because your job was to walk directly into the worst-hit areas, to visit the sick, to record the dying, to advise on treatment. Plague doctors didn't actually cure the plague, not because they were lazy, but because no one understood bacteria yet. Instead, medicine was built around the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. If you were sick, your humors were out of balance, which often meant things like bloodletting, or applying various herbal mixtures that may or may not have done anything at all. There's something almost gently tragic about it. Not dramatic, not loud, just ineffective. And yet, these doctors kept working. They visited homes, they spoke to families, they documented symptoms. Now, let's drift forward in time to the 17th century, where the famous plague doctor outfit finally appears. The outfit is often attributed to Charles Delorme. He proposed a full-body covering made of leather, gloves, boots, and the beak mask. The beak was filled with aromatic herbs. They believed diseases were spread by bad air or miasma. Imagine seeing that figure approach you down a narrow street. Slow steps, dark clothing, a long beak-like mask staring ahead. History prefers a simpler image than reality provides. Many doctors never wore such gear. Some relied on basic cloth coverings. Plague doctors were also record keepers. They documented deaths. In a time of chaos, this kind of record-keeping mattered. There's a kind of quiet dignity in that, just a person showing up, doing a difficult job, and writing things down carefully. Not all were noble. Some saw the position as an opportunity for better pay, because, at the end of the day, they were human. Still, many stayed. Not because they had a cure, but because someone had to be there. As we slowly continue through this quiet history, we'll see that their lives were filled with strange beliefs and moments of humanity. So, gently, without rushing, let's move a little deeper into their world. Now that we've drifted into the general presence of plague doctors, let's settle a little deeper into their day-to-day reality. Not the dramatic version, not the theatrical one, just the slow, practical rhythm of a job that most people avoided and a few reluctantly accepted. Because once a city decided it needed a plague doctor, things became oddly administrative. There were contracts, terms, conditions, payments. Yes, even in the middle of a deadly outbreak, someone still had to discuss salary. A town council would sit down, perhaps a little farther apart than usual just to be safe, and draft an agreement. The doctor would be hired for a fixed period, sometimes a few months, sometimes longer, depending on how stubborn the outbreak was feeling that year. The pay could vary. Some cities offered generous compensation to attract qualified physicians. Others offered less, hoping desperation might fill the gap where money could not. And occasionally, the position went to someone young, inexperienced. Someone who hadn't yet built a reputation and therefore had fewer options. It was, in a way, a strange career shortcut. Risk your life, and maybe, just maybe, build a name for yourself. Or quietly disappear from the records altogether. Both outcomes were on the table. Now the contract usually came with a list of responsibilities, and these were not particularly glamorous. The doctor was expected to visit infected homes, to examine patients, to suggest treatments, to keep records of the sick and the dead. Sometimes they were also asked to supervise quarantine measures, or inspect goods, or advise on public health decisions. And then there were the smaller tasks, the less obvious ones. For example, plague doctors were often called upon to write wills, because when someone knew they might not survive, they wanted their affairs in order. And the doctor became a convenient witness, a house to a son, a ring to a daughter, a few coins set aside for burial. It adds a softer, more human layer to the role, not just treating illness, but standing nearby as people tried to make sense of their final moments. Now, let's talk about those treatments, gently, without expecting too much from them, because if you were a plague doctor, your medical toolkit was limited. You might carry herbs, vinegar, spices, various mixtures that were believed to cleanse or balance the body. You might recommend burning certain materials to purify the air, or keeping windows closed, or open. Opinions varied. Bloodletting, for instance, a very popular method at the time. The idea was simple. If illness came from an imbalance, removing blood might help. It rarely did, but it persisted as a treatment because it fit the theory. When you don't have better explanations, you hold on to the ones you understand. Another approach involved lancing buboes. Doctors would attempt to drain them, hoping to release whatever harmful substance was trapped inside. Again, results were inconsistent, but the effort was there, and sometimes that effort was all they could offer. Now, here's where things become slightly more reflective, because while we might look back and see ineffective treatments, the people at the time saw something different. They saw a figure who showed up, someone who entered the house when others stayed away, someone who tried, even if the outcome rarely changed. And that presence mattered. It didn't cure the disease, but it softened the isolation. Now, of course, not every plague doctor was deeply compassionate. Some kept their distance. Some minimized contact as much as possible. Self-preservation is a very persuasive instinct, but even those who kept their interactions brief still fulfilled a role. They were there. They moved through the city. They became part of the strange, quiet routine that settled over places during outbreaks. A routine where life continued, just more slowly, more cautiously. Streets grew quieter, shops closed earlier, people avoided gatherings, And through all of this, the doctor moved, not dramatically, not urgently, just steadily, from house to house, from street to street. Nothing loud, nothing rushed, just a continuous, subdued motion. Now, over time, cities began to develop more structured responses to outbreaks. And plague doctors were often woven into this system. They might be assigned specific districts, given instructions on how to report cases. It was, in a sense, an early form of public health infrastructure, still imperfect, still based on incomplete knowledge, but moving towards something systematic. For all the danger associated with their job, some plague doctors actually survived multiple outbreaks, not because of special immunity, but perhaps chance, or because they were cautious, careful, a little distant when necessary. Survival in those conditions often came down to small margins, and those who made it through could carry that experience forward. They became, in a quiet way, more valuable, more knowledgeable. There's a kind of subdued resilience in that, not heroic, not dramatic, just steady. As we continue drifting through this world, it becomes clearer that plague doctors were less about dramatic imagery and more about routine. Not the mask, not the costume, not the myths that grew later, but the simple, repetitive act of showing up, day after day. Now, as we ease forward, we'll explore how these doctors were seen by others, and how the line between truth and myth became harder to see. Now that we've settled into the routine of a plague doctor's life, let's gently shift our attention to something a little more intangible. Not what they did, but how they were seen. Because in times of uncertainty, people don't just respond to events, they respond to symbols. And a plague doctor, whether he intended it or not, became one of those symbols. Not always a comforting one. In fact, quite often, the opposite. Imagine for a moment a quiet street. Doors closed, windows slightly open, just enough for someone inside to watch without being seen. The air is still. Conversations have become whispers. Even footsteps seem softer than usual. And then, a figure appears. A doctor, maybe wearing protective clothing, maybe not. Perhaps carrying a bag of tools or herbs, or simply the weight of expectation. People notice. They always notice. Because a plague doctor didn't arrive randomly. He was called, summoned, invited into a space where something had already gone wrong. So when neighbors saw him approaching a house, it didn't feel like reassurance. It felt like confirmation. Something is happening there. Something serious. And suddenly the presence of the doctor became a kind of quiet announcement. Not spoken, not declared, but understood all the same. There's an irony in that. The very person meant to help was also a reminder of danger, not because he caused it, but because he followed it. Now, let's add another layer to this perception. Plague doctors often moved between infected areas. That was their job. They traveled from one household to another, from one street to the next, sometimes even between towns. And in a time when the nature of disease wasn't fully understood, this movement could feel unsettling. Because if illness seemed to follow them, it was easy to draw the wrong conclusion. Not that they were responding to the plague, but that they were somehow connected to it. There were whispers, quiet suspicions. Nothing too loud, at least not most of the time, but enough to create a certain distance between doctor and community. People respected them, yes, needed them, certainly, but also kept a careful eye on them, just in case. Now, this doesn't mean plague doctors were widely feared in a dramatic, theatrical sense. They weren't chased out of towns or treated as villains, but their presence carried weight, a quiet gravity. They were associated with illness, with death, with disruption, and even when they were simply doing their job, that association lingered. It's a bit like seeing storm clouds gathering in the distance. The clouds themselves aren't the storm, but they tell you it's coming. Now, over time, this perception began to shift. slowly, almost imperceptibly, because as stories were told and retold, details started to change. Small adjustments at first, a description here, a bit of exaggeration there, and eventually, a more defined image began to take shape. This is where the famous beaked mask starts to play a larger role. Even though, as we mentioned earlier, it wasn't universally used, it became the most visually distinctive representation of the plague doctor. And once an image like that enters public imagination, it tends to stay. The long beak, the dark clothing, the hat. It's memorable, slightly eerie, easy to picture, even centuries later. And so, gradually, the myth began to form. Not a deliberate myth, not something people consciously invented, but a natural blending of fact and imagination. Because when people think back on a difficult time, they often simplify it. They create symbols, characters, clear images that help make sense of something that was, in reality, messy and uncertain. And the plague doctor became one of those images. Now let's take a moment to appreciate the subtlety of this transformation. In reality, plague doctors were individuals, different backgrounds, different levels of skill, different approaches to their work. But in memory, they became a type, a single, recognizable figure, almost like a character in a story. And like many characters shaped by time, they gained qualities that weren't always accurate. They became more mysterious, more dramatic, more consistent in appearance than they ever were in life. The variability faded, the image remained. Now, here's something quietly interesting. This process didn't happen all at once. It unfolded gradually over generations. Each retelling added a small detail. Each description leaned a little more toward the visual, the unusual, the memorable. And by the time we reach the modern era, the plague doctor is often imagined as that iconic bird-masked figure, moving silently through darkened streets, almost like something out of a dream, or perhaps a very slow, slightly unsettling dream. But if we step back just a little, we can see the difference between that image and the reality we've been exploring. The real plague doctors were quieter, less uniform, more human. They worried about contracts. They negotiated pay. They tried treatments that didn't always work. They moved through cities that were adapting slowly, imperfectly, to a crisis they didn't fully understand. No dramatic entrances, no perfectly consistent costume, just a job, done under difficult conditions. Now, as we continue drifting through this topic, we'll start to explore how these doctors fit into the broader medical world of their time, how they interacted with other practitioners, how knowledge was shared, debated, and sometimes quietly improved, and how, beneath all the myths and imagery, there was a slow, almost invisible progression toward a better understanding of disease. Not fast, not obvious, but there, so gently, without rushing. Let's continue. Let's drift a little further now. Not too quickly, just enough to see the wider world that plague doctors existed within. Because they weren't working alone. They were part of a broader medical landscape, one that was trying hard to make sense of things. It functioned on a mixture of confidence, tradition, and a surprising tolerance for being wrong. Now, if you were living in a medieval city and fell ill, your options were varied. You might visit a trained physician, educated in universities, familiar with classical texts, and comfortable discussing the balance of humours. Or you might see a barber surgeon, a practical sort, skilled with blades, capable of trimming a beard or performing minor surgical procedures. Or perhaps an apothecary who specialized in preparing remedies, herbs, powders and mixtures, some helpful and a few that raised questions. And then, of course, there were the plague doctors, not a completely separate category, but a role that could overlap with all the others. A physician might become a plague doctor during an outbreak, A surgeon might take the position if the pay was right. Even an apothecary might step into the role if circumstances demanded it. It was less about specialization and more about availability. Who is willing to do this? That was often the deciding factor. Within this world, knowledge didn't move quickly. Medical ideas were built on ancient authorities, thinkers whose writings had been studied for centuries. Their work was respected and rarely questioned. When something new appeared, like a fast-moving disease, it didn't lead to new theories. Instead, people tried to fit it into the existing framework. The humors must be out of balance. The air must be corrupted. The environment must be influencing the body in some unseen way. And to be fair, they weren't entirely wrong. They just didn't have the tools to go further. So plague doctors applied treatments that made sense at the time. They observed patterns, they made notes, and occasionally they noticed something useful. For example, the idea of isolation. Even without understanding germs, people recognized that proximity mattered. That being near the sick increased the risk. That keeping people apart could slow the spread. It wasn't always applied effectively, but it was there, a small step. A quiet observation that would, much later, become a central part of disease control. Now let's pause and imagine the mental state of a plague doctor. You've read the texts, you understand the theories, and yet, every day, you're confronted with something that doesn't behave the way it should. Patients don't improve as expected. The disease moves in unpredictable patterns. There's a quiet tension in that. Not dramatic despair, just a steady awareness. An awareness that your knowledge isn't quite enough. And still, the work continues. Because what's the alternative? To stop trying? That wasn't really an option. Now, within this medical world, there was also a social hierarchy. Physicians held higher status. Surgeons handled more physical tasks. Apothecaries prepared remedies, and plague doctors moved between these roles. It was fluid, not always neatly organized, but functional enough to keep things moving. While they didn't discover the true cause, their work contributed to a growing body of observation. They recorded symptoms and timelines. Over time, these observations accumulated, scattered across regions, across years, across different outbreaks. A slow collective memory. Centuries would pass before germ theory or the identification of Yersinia pestis. But the groundwork was being laid through records and repeated encounters, and plague doctors, in their methodical way, were part of that process. Now, let's shift to something more personal. It's easy to forget that plague doctors had lives outside of their profession. They had families and friends, but their role created a certain distance, not just physical distance, but social distance as well. If you visit infected households, people tend to be cautious around you, understandably so. Interactions become more limited. It's not hostility, just caution. The plague doctor exists in a kind of in-between space, respected, but not fully embraced, present, but at a distance. There's something subtly isolating about that, a gentle, ongoing sense of separation. As time moves forward, the role shifts. Medical knowledge improves. Public health measures become more structured. The need for a single designated plague doctor starts to fade. The role becomes less distinct, less central, and eventually, it's more of a historical memory than a necessity. But before we get there, there are still a few more corners to explore. Small details, subtle changes, the kind of things that shape the reality all the same. So without hurrying, let's keep going. Let's drift a little further now into the later stages of this story. Not an ending exactly, more like a gradual softening, the kind where a once urgent role begins to lose its sharp edges and settle into something quieter. Because by the time we reach the 17th century, something interesting has happened. The plague is still present, still feared, still capable of reshaping entire cities, but the way people respond to it is beginning to change, slowly, imperfectly, but noticeably. And this is where that famous image, the beaked mask, steps a little more firmly into view. Now, as we touched on earlier, this outfit is often linked to Charles Delorme, a physician in the court of Louis XIV. He described a protective suit, full coverage, leather or waxed fabric, gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat, and of course the mask, that long, curved beak filled with aromatic materials, herbs, spices, sometimes even small amounts of perfume or vinegar-soaked cloth. The idea was simple. If disease traveled through bad air, then filtering that air might offer protection. It's a very human solution. Work with what you know, adjust what you can, hope it helps. Now, from a modern perspective, it's easy to see the limitations. The mask didn't stop bacteria. The herbs didn't neutralize infection, but it wasn't entirely useless either. The physical barrier of the mask and layers of clothing may have reduced some exposure. A small, accidental benefit. History is full of those. Now, visually, the outfit is striking. There's no getting around that. The silhouette alone, tall, dark, with that distinctive beak, creates an image that stays with you. And that's part of why it endured. When people later tried to remember the time of the plague, this image gave them something clear to hold on to, something that felt appropriately dramatic for such a difficult period. But as always, the reality underneath was more varied. Not every doctor wore this outfit. Not every region adopted it. In many places, plague doctors continued working in simpler forms of protection. The full costume was never truly universal. It just became iconic. And once something becomes iconic, it starts to overshadow everything else. The quieter details fade a little. Now, as we move gently forward, another shift becomes visible. Cities begin to organize themselves more deliberately. Quarantine measures become more structured. Isolation periods are defined more clearly. Officials start tracking outbreaks with greater attention. Not perfectly, but there's a growing sense that this can be managed. Within this evolving system, the role of the plague doctor begins to change. Less central, less singular. Instead of one individual carrying the weight, responsibility starts to spread across institutions like councils and health boards. It's the early shape of public health, still incomplete, but moving in that direction. This shift has a quiet consequence. As systems improve, the need for a dedicated plague doctor begins to fade, just gradually. The role becomes less distinct. The specific figure of the plague doctor starts to dissolve into the broader structure. It begins its transition from reality into memory. Now, memory is an interesting thing. It doesn't preserve everything equally. It keeps what stands out, what feels symbolic. The image that survives is not the tired man negotiating a contract or the quiet figure writing down symptoms. It's the figure in the mask, the beak, the robe, the silhouette against a narrow street. It's a distilled image. The mask was not the most important part of their work. It didn't define their success, but it defined how they were remembered, which says more about us than it does about them. We tend to remember what we can see, not always what mattered most. Plague doctors were not mysterious figures. They were people, working within the limits of their time, trying to understand something that resisted explanation, balancing duty with caution, knowledge with uncertainty. And in doing so, they became part of a larger story, a story about how humans respond to crisis, not with perfect solutions, but with attempts, with observations, with small steps forward, even when the path isn't clear. Eventually, science would uncover the mechanisms behind disease. Bacteria would be identified, transmission understood, treatments developed. The role of the plague doctor would no longer be needed. It would remain as a memory, a symbol, a quiet reminder of a time when people faced something overwhelming and responded with the tools they had. Imperfect tools. Perhaps that's the most fitting way to leave them, not as myths, but as individuals who stood at the edge of the known and kept going. Imagine those quiet streets, those slow footsteps, that steady presence moving through a world trying to understand itself. And without rushing, we'll let that image rest there. Now that we've allowed that image to settle, those quiet streets, those slow footsteps, let's drift just a little further. Not into something louder, not into anything dramatic, just forward, into what came after. Because the story of plague doctors doesn't really end. It softens, it dissolves into the background of a world beginning to understand. And that transition is not sudden. There's no single moment where everything changes, no clear line between confusion and clarity. Instead, there's a long stretch of time where old ideas and new observations exist side by side. A physician might still talk about humors, while also quietly noticing that certain patterns repeat. A city official might still worry about bad air, while also enforcing isolation between households. Two ways of thinking, overlapping, not quite in agreement, but slowly, leaning towards something more accurate. Now, the plague itself doesn't disappear. It continues to appear in different regions, at different times, and each time it returns, people respond with slightly more structure, slightly more awareness. Quarantines become more formal, record-keeping becomes more detailed, responses become more organized. It's not perfect, but it's progress, quiet progress. And within that progress, the role of the plague doctor becomes less central, not because doctors are no longer needed, but because the response to disease is becoming broader, more distributed. Instead, systems begin to take shape. Hospitals become more common, local authorities coordinate efforts more closely, and the work that once fell to a single plague doctor becomes part of a larger network, shared, structured, a little less lonely. Now let's pause on something that doesn't always get much attention. The experiences of those individuals don't simply vanish, they leave traces, in records, in writings, in the quiet accumulation of observations that future generations would build upon. Centuries later, scientists would identify the cause of the plague as a bacterium known as Yersinia pestis, a small, invisible organism. Not bad air, not imbalanced humors, something far more specific. And with that understanding comes a shift. Disease is no longer seen as a vague imbalance, but as something that can be studied, tracked, and eventually treated. It's a profound change, but it rests in part on the quiet groundwork laid by those earlier centuries. All those observations, all those notes, all those attempts to make sense of patterns that didn't yet have clear explanations. Now, of course, the plague doctor didn't know any of this. He wasn't thinking about bacteria or transmission vectors. He was thinking about his next visit, his next patient, his next attempt to help in whatever limited way he could. And yet, his work became part of a much larger arc, a slow movement toward understanding. Now, as knowledge grows, something else begins to change as well. The relationship between society and disease. Fear doesn't disappear, but it becomes more focused, more informed. There's a growing sense that illness has rules, patterns, and if those patterns can be understood, they can be managed, not eliminated entirely, but controlled. And within that shift, the symbolic role of the plague doctor becomes less necessary. There's no longer a need for a single, visible figure to represent the response to disease. Because the response has become modern, now, interestingly, while the real role fades, the image remains. The beaked mask, the long coat, the silhouette. It stays in art, in stories, in the collective memory of a time that feels distant, but still oddly familiar. Because even though the specifics have changed, the underlying experience, the uncertainty, the adaptation, continues to echo. Now, as we ease toward the end of this journey, it's worth reflecting on what we've seen, not in a dramatic summary. Plague doctors were not what the myths suggest. They were not mysterious figures with secret knowledge. They were people, working within the limits of their time, trying to respond to something that didn't yet have clear answers, balancing effort with uncertainty, and in doing so, becoming part of a story that extends far beyond their own lives, a story about how knowledge grows, slowly, imperfectly, but persistently. Now, as you settle a little deeper and the rhythm of this story begins to soften, you can imagine that transition. From confusion to observation to understanding, a long, quiet progression, and somewhere within it, the figure of the plague doctor gradually stepping back, becoming less defined, until all that remains is a memory, a silhouette, a reminder. And with that, we'll let the story gently come to rest. Now that we've let the story come to rest, just for a moment, let's not rush away from it. Instead, let's linger, just a little, because endings, like everything else in this quiet journey, don't arrive all at once. They fade in, softly, almost without being noticed. And the story of plague doctors deserves that kind of ending. Not a sharp conclusion, not a dramatic final note, just a slow exhale. Now, if we look back, very gently, we can still see them. Not the exaggerated figures of memory, not the tall, shadowy silhouettes defined by a long beak and heavy robes, but the quieter version. A man walking down a narrow street, a bag in his hand, a task ahead of him that he cannot fully solve, but will still attempt. There's no audience, no recognition, just the steady rhythm of footsteps, and the quiet understanding that he is needed. And perhaps that is the most human part of this entire story, because it isn't really about masks, or myths, or even the plague itself. It's about response, about how people, when faced with something overwhelming, still choose to act, even without certainty, even without guarantees. Now, over time, the world changes, as it always does. Knowledge grows, systems improve. The chaos that once defined entire generations begins to settle into something more manageable, and within that shift, the need for figures like the plague doctor slowly disappears. Not because they failed, but because the world moved forward. And yet, something of them remains. Not just in art, not just in stories, but in the quiet habits of observation, of care, of showing up even when the outcome is unclear. Those things don't vanish, they carry forward. Now, if we stretch our imagination just a little, softly, we can see how those early efforts connect to what comes later. Hospitals that function with structure, doctors who understand disease at a microscopic level, systems that track, respond, and adapt. All of it built in part on a long history of trying without full understanding, trying without perfect tools, just trying anyway. And somewhere in that long arc of effort, the quiet figure of the plague doctor finds his place, not at the center, not as a hero or a villain, but as part of the foundation. Now, as we come to the very edge of this story, there's one last thing to notice, something subtle, the way memory works. Because even though the reality was complex, what we tend to remember is simple. A mask, a silhouette, a single image. And while that image isn't entirely accurate, it isn't entirely wrong either. It captures something, a feeling, the quiet strangeness of a time when the world felt unfamiliar, and people were still learning how to move through it. Now, as you settle a little deeper, Maybe your thoughts have slowed. Maybe the edges of the story have softened. That's perfectly fine. This isn't a story that needs to stay sharp. It's one that can gently blur and fade and drift away as you rest. So before we fully let go of it, let's take one last quiet look. A street, still and empty. The faint echo of footsteps that are no longer there. A door closing softly somewhere in the distance. And then nothing. Just calm. Just stillness. And that's where we'll leave things tonight. If you've made it this far, thank you for drifting along with me through this slow and quiet piece of history. If you enjoyed this kind of calm storytelling, you can gently like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right to you. And before you settle in completely, feel free to leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always nice to imagine this quiet little corner of the world shared across different places and different nights. For now, rest easy, take your time, and I'll see you in the next story. So, what actually happened to people accused of witchcraft? Not the dramatic thunder-cracking version you might imagine. No sudden lightning, no cinematic gasp, no one dramatically whispering, "She's a witch," as the camera zooms in. No, it was usually much quieter than that. It often began with something small, something almost forgettable. A cow stopped giving milk. A child developed a fever that didn't go away. Bread refused to rise, which, in a world without baking tutorials, felt deeply suspicious. And, of course, someone had to be responsible, because randomness was not a comforting idea back then. Randomness meant no control, and people don't like that. So instead, they looked around, and sooner or later, someone didn't quite fit. Maybe she lived alone. Maybe she spoke a little too directly. Maybe she had a habit of muttering to herself while gathering herbs. Or perhaps she had simply annoyed the wrong neighbor on the wrong day. Because accusations didn't require proof. They required discomfort. And once that discomfort found a target, things began to move. Slowly at first. A whisper here, a raised eyebrow there. Someone recalling with sudden certainty that yes, now that you mention it, she did look rather strange. And wasn't there that time when the neighbor's dog barked at her for no reason? Yes, very suspicious. Let's just say, reputations didn't age well in these environments, and once suspicion settled in, it rarely left. It spread, gently at first, like fog creeping over a field. Conversations became quieter when the accused walked by. People avoided eye contact. Small interactions turned stiff, and in a world where community was survival, being slowly pushed to the edges was already a kind of punishment. But the real shift came when whispers turned into something official, because eventually someone would say it out loud. She might be a witch. And that sentence, soft as it sounded, carried weight, not just socially, but legally. Now, here's where things become a little more structured, because contrary to the chaotic image we often imagine, many witchcraft accusations followed a kind of process. Not a fair one, but a process nonetheless. Local authorities would step in, and once they did, the situation moved from rumor to record. The accused would be called in for questioning, which sounds polite. It was not. These interrogations were often long, repetitive, and deeply exhausting. The goal was not really to discover truth. The goal was to confirm suspicion, and there's a subtle difference there, because when you begin with the assumption that someone is guilty, every answer they give starts to feel like proof. If they deny it, they're lying. If they hesitate, they're hiding something. If they cry, well, that just means they're overwhelmed by their own guilt, obviously. Imagine being in that position. You're tired, You're confused. You're surrounded by people who already seem to have made up their minds. And every word you say is carefully noted, often twisted, and sometimes repeated back to you in a way that sounds worse. You weren't asked if you harmed the cow. Instead, you might be asked if you had ever made a pact with the devil, if you had attended secret gatherings in the night, if you had flown, yes, flown, through the air to meet other witches. It's almost impressive, in a bleak way, how the system managed to trap people no matter what they did. Say no too quickly, you're rehearsed. Take a moment to think, clearly remembering something incriminating. Cry, emotional instability, stay calm, unnatural composure, definitely a witch. And as this questioning went on, something else began to happen. More accusations. Fear doesn't just stay contained, it spreads. The quiet village became a web of suspicion, with each thread pulling tighter. And this is where things start to feel heavy. Because at this point, the accused was no longer just dealing with one allegation. They were facing a growing narrative. If the authorities felt there was enough suspicion, the accused might be formally charged, which meant things became more serious, more dangerous. They could be detained, sometimes in local holding cells. While this was happening, the community watched, not always with anger, sometimes with relief. If something had gone wrong, it was oddly comforting to believe there was a cause, a person you could point to. Humans really like shapes. Now, let's drift a little deeper. There was always the question of proof. But how exactly do you prove something like witchcraft? There were tests, strange ones. For example, there was the idea that witches might have a mark somewhere on their body. So examiners would search for these marks. They would poke, prod, press. And if the accused didn't react strongly enough, well, that was confirmation. Then there were other methods. Some places believed that witches could not properly recite prayers, and if they stumbled, even slightly. Keep in mind, these were people under extreme stress, terrified, surrounded by authority figures watching every breath. So yes, sometimes they stumbled. As these proofs accumulated, the case grew stronger, not because it was solid, but because it was consistent with what people already believed. At this stage, something else often entered the picture: confession. Why would anyone confess? The answer is complicated. Sometimes it was the pressure, the isolation, the sense that no matter what you said, the outcome was already decided. At some point, the goal shifts. It's no longer about defending your innocence, it's about stopping the process, about reaching an end, any end. And so, slowly, quietly, the story would complete itself. From suspicion to certainty, even if that certainty was built on very little. And as we continue drifting through this world, it becomes clear that the accusation was only the beginning. The path forward became very narrow and very difficult to escape. Let's keep moving, gently, into what happened next. And so, once the word confession entered the room, everything seemed to settle. Not in a comforting way, not like a problem had been solved, but in that quiet, uneasy way a story settles when everyone decides, yes, this must be how it ends. Because once someone confessed to witchcraft, the entire structure around them suddenly felt justified. The whispers, the suspicion, the long hours of questioning, all of it now appeared to have been leading somewhere meaningful, even if, quietly, it hadn't. Now, confessions themselves were rarely simple. They weren't just, yes, I am a witch. That would have been far too straightforward. Instead, they often grew into elaborate stories. Stories shaped, sometimes gently and sometimes quite firmly, by the people doing the questioning. The accused might begin with a hesitant admission, something vague, something like, I may have done wrong, or I remember strange dreams. And that was enough, because from there the details could be encouraged. Questions would guide the narrative forward. Had they met the devil? What did he look like? When did this happen? Were there others? What did they do together? And slowly, piece by piece, a very specific kind of story would emerge, one that matched expectations. Because that's the interesting part. These confessions often sounded similar. Across different villages, different countries, even different decades, the same patterns appeared. The same meetings in the night, the same shadowy figures, the same rituals, described in ways that felt oddly consistent, not because they were real, but because they were familiar. People already had an idea of what witchcraft looked like, and under pressure, guided by questioning, that idea became the script, and the accused simply followed along. Now, once a confession had been recorded, the process moved forward with a kind of quiet inevitability. The case would be presented more formally, documents might be written, testimonies collected, statements repeated and refined until they sounded convincing. And then came the waiting, which, in its own way, was one of the most difficult parts, because waiting leaves space for thoughts. The accused, often held in small, uncomfortable conditions, had time to sit with everything that had happened, time to replay the questions, the answers, the moment they realized that no answer would save them. Time, perhaps, to wonder how things had spiraled so far from something so small, a sick cow, a bad harvest, a neighbor's suspicion. It's almost strangely fragile when you look at it like that. How easily a life could tilt, just slightly, and then keep going, steadily, until there was no way back. Meanwhile, outside those holding spaces, the community continued its quiet observation. And this is where things become a little more layered. Because not everyone was equally certain. Some people believed fully, completely. To them, the confession was proof. But others were less sure. Not openly doubtful, of course. That would have been risky. But quietly, internally, there might have been hesitation. A small, persistent thought that something didn't quite add up. That perhaps the person they had known didn't suddenly become what the accusations claimed. But in environments like this, doubt doesn't travel very far. It stays contained, unspoken, because speaking it out loud might draw attention. And attention, as we've seen, was not something you wanted. So the process continued, and eventually it reached the point of judgment. Now, trials for witchcraft were not always grand events, not the dramatic courtroom scenes we might imagine. Often they were smaller, more subdued, conducted by local officials, sometimes with input from religious authorities. But the structure was there. The accusations would be presented. The confession, if there was one, would be read aloud. Witnesses might speak, recounting strange events, unusual behaviors, moments that now, in hindsight, felt significant. It's interesting how hindsight works in these situations. Things that once seemed ordinary suddenly take on new meaning. A casual remark becomes ominous. A coincidence becomes a sign. Because once the idea of witchcraft is introduced, everything starts to bend around it. And so the trial moved forward, not as an open question, but as a kind of confirmation, a final step in a process that had already decided its outcome. Now there were cases, rare but they existed, where the accused was acquitted, where the evidence was considered insufficient, where doubt somehow managed to hold its ground. But those cases were not the norm. More often the path led in one direction, toward a verdict that felt, to those involved, almost inevitable. And that verdict carried weight, because it didn't just decide guilt or innocence. It determined what would happen next. And this is where things take on a slower, heavier tone. The exact outcome varied depending on the time and place, but in many cases, The result was some form of execution. Now, even here, things were not always as we imagine. It wasn't always dramatic, chaotic scenes filled with shouting crowds. Sometimes it was quieter than that, more procedural. The condemned might be given time to prepare, time to reflect. Religious figures often became involved at this stage, offering guidance, encouraging repentance, not necessarily for witchcraft, but for the soul. Because in the worldview of the time, this wasn't just about earthly justice, it was about something larger, something eternal. It's a strange contrast when you think about it. A system that could be so harsh, and yet so focused on spiritual resolution at the end. Now let's pause here, just briefly, and notice something subtle. Not everyone accused of witchcraft met this fate. In some regions, accusations were frequent, trials common. In others, things were quieter, more skeptical. Authorities might be more cautious. And in those places, the process could stall. Accusations might fade. The accused might return quietly to their lives. Because even without a conviction, suspicion tends to linger, like a faint shadow, difficult to fully erase. But let's return to the more common path. As the sentence approached, the community once again became part of the story. Present, watching. There's something about shared events that draws people together, a sense of witnessing something that confirms the values of the group, and at the center of it all was the person who had been just another member of that same community, now standing apart, defined by a single word: witch. It's a stark transformation, and one that, once complete, was very difficult to reverse. But something else begins to emerge. A pattern. Because these events didn't happen in isolation, they appeared in waves. Periods where accusations rose, spread and intensified, followed by quieter stretches, almost like a tide. And understanding that tide helps explain why so many people found themselves caught in it. Because it wasn't just about individual accusations, it was about the environment, the fears, the beliefs, all of it coming together, until the conditions were just right for suspicion to grow. And once it did, it rarely stayed small. Let's drift a little further into how these waves formed, and why they became so powerful. And if we just let the scene soften for a moment, if we step slightly away from the individual stories, something wider begins to come into view. Because witchcraft accusations were rarely isolated incidents. They didn't just appear randomly one by one like quiet little misunderstandings. No, they tended to gather, to cluster, to rise together in what can only be described as waves. And these waves had a rhythm to them, a slow build, a sudden swell, and then eventually a gradual retreat. Now, what caused these waves is not one single thing. It's not as simple as saying people were just more superstitious back then, because, as it turns out, the situation was far more layered. Let's start with something very ordinary. Hardship. Not dramatic, storybook hardship, just the kind that quietly settles into daily life. Poor harvests, long winters, illness that lingers a little too long, the sort of conditions that make people uneasy. And when uneasiness builds, it looks for direction, it looks for explanation, because living in a world where things simply go wrong for no clear reason is deeply uncomfortable. So instead, people searched for causes, and not abstract ones, not complex systems. They looked for human causes. Someone to point to, someone to say, this happened because of them. And that's where the idea of witchcraft became useful. If crops failed, perhaps someone cursed them. If a child fell ill, perhaps someone wished it. It created a narrative. Now, add to this something else. Religion. Not in a broad sense, but the specific way it functioned during certain periods of European history. Because belief systems didn't just include good, they included a very real, very active concept of evil, a presence that could influence the world. And within that framework, witches were not just unusual individuals, they were threats, agents of something much larger and much darker. Accusing someone wasn't just about personal conflict, it became almost a moral duty, a way of keeping the community safe. Now let's gently add another layer. Authority. During periods of intense hunting, certain manuals began to circulate. These texts didn't just describe witches, they explained how to find them, how to question them, how to interpret their behavior. Local officials now had guidance, a framework, a set of steps to follow, suspicion leading to questioning, questioning leading to evidence. Now, here's where the wave begins to swell. Once a few accusations take hold, they don't just stay contained, they spread faster. Suddenly, ordinary events feel less ordinary. A creaking door at night, a shadow that moves differently, a person who seems a bit too calm. Communities turn inward, trust becomes fragile. If witches are believed to be hidden among ordinary people, then anyone could be suspect. Some individuals pushed accusations forward, others followed along, and some quietly resisted. But those voices were often soft. In some areas, the intensity grew quite high. In others, there was more hesitation, more skepticism, and that slowing made a difference. Now, here's where the tide begins, very slowly, to shift, because waves, by their nature, don't last forever. Authorities started to apply more caution, requiring stronger proof, limiting certain practices, and over time, these small changes added up. Crops still failed sometimes, illness still appeared, life remained unpredictable. But the explanation began to shift. What happened wasn't just about individual moments, it was a pattern shaped by fear, belief, environment, and human nature. The tide rose, carried many with it, and then slowly receded, leaving behind stories that feel, even now, a little difficult to fully grasp. So let's drift just a little further into how this long chapter finally began to close. And as the tide slowly begins to pull back, something almost imperceptible happens. Nothing dramatic, no grand announcement, no moment where everyone suddenly looks around and says, "Ah, perhaps we got a few things wrong." That would be far too neat. Instead, the shift is quiet, subtle, the kind of change that doesn't feel like change at all when you're living inside it. Because even as accusations become less frequent, the belief itself doesn't vanish overnight. It lingers, softly, in the background. People still talk about witches. They still tell stories, still remember who was accused, who confessed, who didn't come back. Those memories don't just disappear. They settle into the edges of everyday life. But something is different now. A kind of hesitation begins to appear. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in small, scattered ways. A magistrate might pause before moving forward. A local official might ask for more evidence. A religious figure might gently suggest caution. And that hesitation, even when it's slight, matters. Because it interrupts the rhythm we've been watching, the pattern of suspicion, interrogation, confession, and judgment. It creates a gap, and in that gap, questions can exist. Now let's float gently into one of the more interesting parts of this shift. Some individuals began to notice something a little unusual. The confessions. They were similar, a bit too similar. The same meetings, the same descriptions, repeated across different regions. At first, this might have seemed like confirmation, but slowly, for some, it began to feel more like repetition, like a script. And once that thought takes hold, it's difficult to ignore. If these stories are shaped by expectation, What does that say about the process? Now, alongside this growing awareness, something else begins to shift. The way people think about evidence. Authorities begin to ask for clearer connections, more reliable testimony, less reliance on things that can be easily influenced, like confessions under pressure. And this again creates friction because it slows things down, and when processes slow down, they become harder to sustain. The same systems that once fueled the spread of accusations also played a role in slowing them down. Structured procedures, written records, formal trials. Because once you begin to document things, to compare cases, patterns emerge, and patterns invite scrutiny. So in a quiet way, the system begins to question itself, not loudly, not all at once, but enough. During this period, the broader world is also changing. New ideas are beginning to circulate. Ideas about nature, about cause and effect. A failed harvest might still raise suspicion, but it might also be seen as weather, poor soil, timing. And as these alternative explanations become more familiar, the need for a human cause begins to fade. Just slightly, just enough. None of this happens in a straight line. There are still moments where accusations flare up again, because belief systems don't disappear cleanly. They echo, they resurface, especially in times of stress or uncertainty. But the overall trend, slowly, begins to move in a different direction, toward caution, toward skepticism, toward a quieter, less certain way of interpreting the world. The accused are no longer automatically seen as the center of a supernatural threat. Instead, there is space, however small, for doubt. Now, let's gently drift into the personal side. Communities still remember. Families still carry the weight of what happened. Names are still associated with accusations. Those social memories linger, quietly, sometimes unspoken, but present. On one hand, the system is becoming more restrained. On the other hand, the social impact of past accusations continues to ripple outward. As we move further along this slow unraveling, something else begins to appear. Reflection. People begin to look back, to consider what has happened, to notice inconsistencies, and gradually, the idea takes shape that perhaps the system itself had flaws, that some methods used were unreliable. The tide, which once rose so steadily, has now largely receded, leaving behind a quieter landscape, but also a complicated one. What remains is not just the absence of accusations, it's the presence of memory, of questions that don't always have clear answers, the need to explain uncertainty, the tendency to look for causes, the way fear can shape perception, and the slow, often uneven process of learning to question those perceptions. It's not a story with a sharp ending, just a gradual fading, a quiet shift, from certainty to uncertainty again, carrying the memory of what came before. As we continue to drift, there's one final layer, not what happened then, but how those events have been remembered and retold. And so, as everything begins to quiet down, as the trials become less frequent and the urgency fades into something softer, we're left with something that lingers a little longer than the events themselves. Memory. Not sharp, not always accurate, but persistent. Because what happened to people accused of witchcraft didn't simply end when the accusations stopped. It didn't neatly close like a finished chapter. It stayed. In stories, in records, in the way communities remembered certain names and quietly avoided others. And memory, as it turns out, has its own way of shaping the future. Now, at first, these memories weren't necessarily reflective. They weren't analyzed or questioned in any deep, systematic way. They were simply accepted. folded into the broader understanding of how the world worked. Yes, that happened, people might say, in a calm, almost distant tone, and then move on. But over time, distance grows, generations pass, and with that distance comes a kind of perspective, not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, because when you're no longer living inside a belief, you can start to look at it from the outside, and from the outside, things often look different. Now, let's gently drift into one of the quieter changes, the way these stories began to be recorded. Earlier, records were often practical, legal documents, trial transcripts, lists of accusations and outcomes. But as time went on, those records became something else as well, historical material, something to be read, not just used. And when people began to read these records, sometimes years or decades later, they noticed patterns, the repetition, the similarities in confessions, the way certain details appeared again and again across different cases. And slowly, the tone of these readings began to shift, from acceptance to curiosity, and then, for some, to doubt. Not loud doubt, not confrontational, just a quiet sense that something didn't quite align. Now, alongside this, broader intellectual changes were taking place. Ideas about evidence, reasoning, and observation were evolving, again, slowly but steadily. And as these ideas became more widespread, they influenced how people interpreted the past. Events that once seemed clear and justified began to feel more complicated, less certain, because if you apply newer ways of thinking to older events, the conclusions don't always match. And so, the story of witchcraft accusations began to shift, not in what happened, but in how it was understood. Now, let's pause here for a moment and notice something gently ironic. At the time, accusations of witchcraft were often seen as necessary, as protective, as a way of maintaining order and safety. But later, those same actions began to be viewed through a different lens, as mistakes, as overreactions, as moments where fear and belief had, perhaps, gone too far. It's a quiet reversal, not immediate, not universal, but present. And as this new perspective grew, something else began to emerge, a kind of careful reflection. Not just on witchcraft accusations, but on the systems that allowed them to happen, the legal processes, the methods of questioning, the reliance on certain types of evidence. All of these things came under gentle scrutiny, and that scrutiny slowly influenced change. Because once you begin to recognize that a system can produce flawed outcomes, you become a little more cautious about how that system is used. It doesn't fix everything, but it shifts the approach. Now, as this reflection deepened, the individuals who had once been accused began to be seen differently, not as threats, but as victims of circumstance, of belief, of a system that, at the time, felt certain, but was not always reliable. And that shift in perspective matters, because it changes the emotional tone of the story, from one of judgment to one of quiet sympathy, not loudly expressed, not dramatically stated, just present. Now, let's gently move into how these stories continued to be told, because they didn't disappear. They became part of a larger historical narrative, something people looked back on when thinking about the past, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a curiosity, sometimes simply as a reflection of how different the world once felt. And in that retelling, certain elements stood out: the strangeness of the accusations, the intensity of the beliefs, the fragility of the evidence, all of it creating a picture that felt distant, almost difficult to fully relate to, and yet not entirely unfamiliar. Because if we look closely, The underlying patterns are still recognizable. The need to explain uncertainty. The tendency to assign blame. The way groups can form around shared beliefs, reinforcing each other over time. These are not things limited to one period. They are quietly part of human behavior. And that's perhaps the most interesting part of this long story. Not just what happened, but what it reveals. Now, as we begin to settle toward the end of this slow journey, there's one final layer to consider. How these events are remembered today. Because modern perspectives tend to frame witchcraft accusations in a very particular way. As examples of misunderstanding, of fear, of systems that, while structured, were deeply influenced by the beliefs of their time. And that framing carries a certain clarity, a sense that we understand what went wrong, that we can look back and say, with confidence, that was not the right way to approach things. But even here, it's worth keeping a gentle sense of awareness, because every time period has its own beliefs, its own assumptions, its own ways of interpreting the world, and from the inside, those beliefs often feel just as certain, just as reasonable, as the ones we've been drifting through tonight. So perhaps the most lasting part of this story is not the accusations themselves, or the trials. It's the reminder that certainty can feel very solid, even when it's built on something fragile, and that questioning, even when it's quiet, can slowly change the course of things. Not quickly, not dramatically, but enough to shift the tide. And so, as everything settles, as the memories soften and the story gently comes to rest, we're left not with a sharp conclusion, but with a quiet understanding that what happened to people accused of witchcraft was not just a series of events in the past. It was part of a larger pattern, one that reflects how humans respond to fear, uncertainty, and the need for explanation. A pattern that, once seen, is difficult to forget. And perhaps that's where we'll leave it. Right here, in that quiet space between what was and how we remember it now. And after all the trials, all the confessions, all the careful unweaving of belief, there's still something left behind. Not drama, not spectacle, just residue. The kind of residue that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It just quietly sits in the background of history, shaping how people think long after the actual events have stopped happening. Because witchcraft accusations didn't vanish in a clean line across time. They faded unevenly, like ink slowly thinning in water. In some places they stopped earlier. In others, they lingered far longer than you might expect. And in a few isolated cases, they even resurfaced later, wrapped in new language but carrying the same emotional weight underneath. That's the part that tends to get overlooked. Not the intensity of the period itself, but the afterlife of the idea. Because once a society has gone through a cycle of fear like that, it doesn't just reset to zero. It remembers, even if it tries not to. Now, let's drift gently into something quieter. The people who survived the accusations, the ones who were released, or acquitted, or simply forgotten by the system before it fully consumed them. Their stories are often less documented, less preserved. Absence of record doesn't mean absence of experience. And those who did survive often carried something difficult to describe, more like social echoes, a changed way of being seen, a name that had once been ordinary, now carrying a faint trace of suspicion. Because in these systems, full exoneration didn't always erase perception, it just reduced it. So people moved carefully, rebuilt slowly, sometimes relocated entirely, starting fresh in places where their past wasn't known. Because anonymity in those moments could feel like relief. Now let's look at the broader emotional landscape. What happens to a community after fear has shaped decisions, after neighbors have accused neighbors? The answer isn't simple. Instead, there's a gradual cooling, a return to ordinary life. But ordinary life is not untouched. It carries memory. You can sometimes see it in hesitation, in the way authorities in later years become more careful about acting on suspicion alone, because something has been learned. And as witchcraft fades as a legal accusation, it begins to shift category, from legal reality to historical memory. Historians and writers begin to revisit the records, the trials, the testimonies, the confessions, and with distance they start to notice the patterns, the pressure in questioning, the repetition in language. It becomes less about individual guilt and more about systems, structures, environments. Now, here's where things become quietly reflective. A pattern emerges that feels uncomfortably familiar. The way fear spreads, the way uncertainty seeks explanation, the way groups reinforce each other's beliefs. And once you recognize that pattern, it doesn't stay in the past. It becomes something you can see elsewhere too. Now, let's return to the people. Farmers, midwives, widows, healers, just ordinary people. Caught in a moment where ordinary explanations no longer felt sufficient. Their ordinariness became irrelevant, or even suspicious. How quickly familiarity can turn into unfamiliarity when perception changes. Modern culture has absorbed these stories. They've become symbols of hysteria, fear, and collective misjudgment. But what actually happened was not one single thing. It was a long, uneven process of belief, law, and human psychology. It unfolded slowly, then quickly, then slowly again, and finally, not at all. What remains is not a single answer. It's a sequence of human reactions under uncertainty, a long aftermath, and maybe that's the quietest point to end on. Not closure, not resolution, just awareness that what once felt certain rarely stays that way forever. And in that awareness, the story finally settles. And even after everything has faded into history books, there's still one uncomfortable truth that tends to sit in the background of this entire subject. It never truly ends in a single moment. Not really, because beliefs don't switch off like a lamp. They don't vanish just because the laws change or because institutions stop officially endorsing them. Instead, they linger in smaller, quieter forms. Sometimes as folklore, sometimes as superstition, sometimes just as half-remembered warnings passed down in families. Don't go out at night. Be careful what you say about certain people. Some things are better left alone. And even when the word witchcraft stops being a legal category in most places, the underlying instincts that supported it don't disappear overnight. They just find other expressions. Now, let's drift gently into the final shape these stories take in memory. Because over time, the narrative changes again. In earlier periods, it was about danger. Then, as skepticism grows, it becomes about injustice. And later still, it becomes something closer to reflection. A way to examine how societies behave under pressure. But there's another layer underneath even that. Something quieter, more human. Because when you strip away the labels, witch, accuser, authority, you're left with a pattern of people trying to make sense of things they don't understand, and sometimes doing it poorly. Now, one of the more interesting developments is the shift in focus from what they believed to why they believed it. And that question opens a lot of doors, because it forces us to look at environment again, at uncertainty, at fear of randomness, at the psychological comfort of explanation, even when that explanation is wrong. And suddenly, witch trials stop being just a historical curiosity. They become a case study in how humans behave when faced with uncontrollable events, illness, crop failure, death, misfortune that arrives without warning or clear cause. In those moments, the mind doesn't like to stay empty. It fills the space. And what fills it depends heavily on the world you're living in. If your worldview includes invisible forces, spirits, moral imbalance, or personal curses, then those explanations become available. Not necessarily because they are proven, but because they are meaningful, and meaning often matters more than accuracy in moments of stress. Now, let's gently shift to another aspect that often gets overlooked: the role of ordinary social dynamics. Because not every accusation came from abstract fear or institutional pressure. Some came from very human places: conflicts between neighbors, long-standing resentments, small disputes that slowly accumulated over time, a disagreement over land, a failed business deal, a personal insult that never quite healed. And in a system where accusations carried serious weight, those personal tensions could escalate in ways that feel disproportionate from a modern perspective. But within that context, they made a kind of sense. Not a fair sense, not a justified sense, but a comprehensible one. And that distinction matters, because understanding why something happened is not the same as endorsing it. It's simply recognizing the mechanisms that allowed it to happen. Now, as we approach the final drift of this entire topic, it becomes clear that witchcraft accusations were not just about individuals being accused. They were about systems of interpretation, about how communities explained misfortune, about how authority and belief reinforced each other, and about how easily uncertainty can be redirected toward human targets. And once you see that pattern, it becomes hard not to notice it elsewhere in history, in different forms, different names, different contexts, because the underlying structure is surprisingly adaptable. Fear arises, explanation is needed, a target is identified. The system reinforces the target, and then consequences follow. The details change, but the shape often rhymes. Now, as we gently slow down toward the end of this long, drifting exploration, it's worth returning to the people at the center one last time, not as symbols, not as historical examples, but as individuals who lived inside a moment they did not control. Because one of the most important things these stories leave behind is a sense of scale. How small a trigger could lead to such large consequences. How quickly perception could shift, how fragile reputation could be in certain conditions, and how difficult it was, once a narrative formed, to step outside of it, even when that narrative was wrong. And so, when we look back now, centuries later, the question is no longer just what happened. It becomes something quieter, more reflective. How did people end up here? And that question doesn't have a single answer. It has layers: belief, fear, structure, environment, human behavior, all interacting in ways that were at the time difficult to separate. And perhaps that is the final lingering lesson of this entire long and uneasy chapter. That certainty once formed can feel very solid, even when it rests on something far more fragile than it appears. And that the line between explanation and imagination is not always as clear as we assume, especially when fear enters the picture. So as this story finally comes to rest, it doesn't end with resolution. It ends with awareness, a quiet understanding that what happened then was not just about witches, or trials, or confessions. It was about people, trying to make sense of a world that didn't always offer clear answers, and sometimes choosing the wrong ones. And in that silence after the story, there's nothing more to add, just space, and the echo of something that history hasn't quite let go of, even now. And eventually, even echoes begin to fade, not suddenly, not cleanly, but in that slow, almost unnoticeable way, where a story stops feeling like something that happened and starts feeling like something that is simply known. Witchcraft accusations, in the strict historical sense, drift further and further back, not erased, just relocated into the past, where they can be observed instead of experienced. And once they settle there, something interesting happens. They stop being a fear and start becoming a question. Not, is this happening to us, but how did this happen at all? And that shift changes the entire emotional weight of the subject, because distance has a way of softening even the harshest histories, not by removing their seriousness, but by making them easier to hold in the mind without flinching. Now, as we reach the final stretch of this long reflection, it's worth noticing how the story has quietly transformed. It started with suspicion, then accusation, then structure, then belief, then doubt, and finally, reflection. A full cycle, not of certainty, but of understanding growing slowly around uncertainty itself. And at the center of all of it were ordinary people living in extraordinary interpretations of ordinary problems. That part tends to stay the most unsettling, because it removes the idea that everything was distant or abstract. It wasn't. It was local, familiar, human-scaled. And that's exactly why it was so powerful at the time. Now, let's gently trace the final emotional residue this history leaves behind, because today, witch trials are not just studied as legal events. They are often used as a mirror, a way to think about how groups form beliefs, how authority can reinforce assumptions, how fear can organize itself into systems that feel logical from the inside, even when they collapse under scrutiny from the outside, and perhaps most importantly, how easy it is for everyone believes it to become a substitute for evidence. That's the quiet warning embedded in this entire history. Not loud, not dramatic, just persistent. Now, as we drift into the very end, it's important to acknowledge something simple. We are not standing above this history. We are standing after it, with different tools, different frameworks, different assumptions about evidence and truth. But the underlying human mechanisms, the need for explanation, the comfort of certainty, those haven't disappeared. They've just changed shape. So when we look back at people accused of witchcraft, we are seeing human behavior under different conditions. And that distinction matters more than it first appears, because it turns the story from something distant and strange into something recognizably human. And in doing so, it quietly removes the comfort of thinking, this could never happen again. Not because history repeats exactly, but because the underlying patterns can reappear in new forms whenever the conditions align: uncertainty, fear, pressure, and a need for explanation that feels immediate and satisfying. Now, as we finally let this entire narrative settle, there is no dramatic conclusion waiting at the end of it. No final revelation. No single takeaway that wraps everything neatly. Instead, what remains is something softer. A sense of perspective, a sense of scale, and a reminder that some consequential events did not begin with certainty. They began with questions, and sometimes with the wrong answers becoming too widely accepted. So, as this long, slow journey comes to its final pause, we leave it here, not with closure, but with awareness that what happened was never just about witchcraft. It was about the fragile ways humans try to make sense of an uncertain world, and how those attempts can shape lives far more deeply than the original uncertainty ever did. And then, finally, it fades, not forgotten, just no longer unfolding. A finished echo in the long, quiet memory of history.